This is the Cambridge Creative Writing Centre series of conversations with writers. We're excited to have you here. For anyone who doesn't know, today I'm in conversation with Usha Akella, the festival director and poet and former student at ICE. Welcome, Usha.
Hi, thank you, Lucy. It's good to be here.
Usha, the first thing I wanted to ask you about was your sense of yourself as a writer. I was really interested. I was reading an interview that you'd done where you were talking about the fact that as quite a young child, you'd written and written and written, and I think you just didn't at that time perhaps have a sense of why or where it was heading. And I wondered if you could just talk about that sense of yourself and how that kind of notion of yourself as, no, I am a writer started to emerge.
Well, I think it kind of, it happened in a very unconscious way. I think that's the article you're referring to. I was very young, maybe grade 5 in India, and it was this beautiful moment. It was a poem by Keats, I think, and I kind of subliminally knew that that's something I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I went home and wrote my first poem. And onward, I just kept trying, writing in my little notebook. In South India, I grew up in a city called Hyderabad. By the time I was a young girl, we didn't have the kind of opportunities that we have now that's part of a standardized poetry industry. We didn't have coffee shops where you went and read. We didn't have magazines. We didn't have poetry readings. We didn't have creative writing programs. And still, a great many universities and colleges don't have standardized MFAs in creative writing or MAs in creative writing even now. So I kind of nurtured myself for a good 20 years or so. And then I moved to the States in 93. And about a year later is when I took my first writing class. I went to a poetry reading at a coffee shop, and it was the most wondrous thing that you could stand there, read your poems, and somebody would actually listen to you. It really was magical. I think 93 onwards is when I think it was a very silent dream till that point, but it was the only dream I had. By 10, I was saying I'm going to be a poet, not even a playwright or a short story writer. It was, I'm going to be a poet one day, I'm going to be a poet one day. And the next best thing I could do in India was I could do a master's in English literature. And I went to a marvelous university where my teachers were all either educated in the UK or the USA. They came back with PhDs, and they were teaching in all these various programs throughout India. And one of them was, there were a series of central universities, and there was one in my city. And I went to a very equipped English department and had a fabulous first-rate education there. I think that really set the foundation. Because for 2 years, I read a lot, all I did was read and do my assignments, but I was reading heavily for 2 years. And I think the other side of writing is reading. I mean, there's the two sides of a coin. The more you read, the more you're absorbing the rules and standards of the kind of writer you'd like to become. So it was doing that. It was nurturing, I think, my understanding of the craft in a very unconscious way. It was setting standards, and I wasn't articulating any of this on the conscious level, but this was kind of happening. So I take those 2 years really as the first training period as a writer. There are times you need to be silent and listen. There are times you need to be silent and work. So I think I started the work then, but it was just coming in through the back door, in a different way. And then I moved to the States, had my first writing class, and then began to find the courage, to say, yes, I am a poet. And, being able to look someone in the eye and say, I am a poet. What do you do? I am a poet. To say those 3 words, those 4 words, it took a good 32 years, I think, or maybe 20 years. And that's it. From 93, it's been just a lot of hard work, writing, getting rejected, waiting for that first book, and all the, the veering and the circumambulatory of the journey, all of that began after 93 in a much more formal, self-conscious kind of way. So.
And did I read that, did you do a business, was that when you were doing a business degree that you?
No, I have no head for business at all.
But you're an entrepreneur, and we'll get onto that in a little while. I'm intrigued about the studying literature and you said English literature, and I
Yeah.
was interested to hear. I mean, it sounds like you're describing an apprenticeship, really. And I think some people go into literature because they just love reading, and
Yeah.
actually other people go into it because they're going to write. They've
Yeah.
decided
Yeah. Yeah.
they just need to learn their craft. But I wondered if you could talk about the writers that particularly inspired you when you were doing that degree.
Well, basically, the canon was the UK canon, a lot, mostly. I think it's because of the affinity between the two countries and the cultural and political history we've had in common. So while growing up in India, we read a lot of the British canon. You know, in our undergrad, there was Eliot and Keats and all of that. And then we did it much more systematically when I was doing my literature. Like I remember doing a course on Victorian literature and post modern, the modern current, and D.H. Lawrence and so on. So we were basically reading, and I remember one course on Indian English writers, doing one course, but the rest of it was the UK canon and American writing, you know, as you took your electives. So I was reading a lot of that stuff, grew up on, you know, Austen and Hardy and Lawrence and Charles Dickens and Shaw, uh, uh, exposed to a lot of that literature. And then along the way, you start to do your own reading. You find your own inspiration, you know, with certain writers, and the journey just unfolds, you know, step by step. I remember for me, Eliot, you know, they're kind of these moments that become very, you know, very intense because they have something to do with, I think, unfolding your own poetics, you know. Uh, while you're learning from everyone in some way, some poets and writers just they do it more pointedly because, you know, either there's some kind of synchronicity or there's some kind of echoing in how you'd like to write, maybe, or what is it you'd like to achieve, and somehow they've set the ground for it. You know, it there could be various reasons why someone stands out for you. So for me, I remember Eliot was very pivotal at one point because uh, sound and the whole oral quality in poetry was something I found. So I come from a very oral culture. You know, we grew up with Sanskrit verses being chanted every day of our lives. You know, it's Bollywood music. On festival days, they're devotional and religious songs. So I grew up in a very, you know, my ear was very attuned in some way, I think, to just the oral quality of poetry. And then so Eliot did that for me, and I just loved how he used sound patterns, you know, without something being necessarily, say, end rhymed or anything, but he played with internal rhyme and internal consonantal echoes and all of that. I really love that. The romantics were very important for me, and I think that has something to do with sensibility. They were asking those questions of mortality and why we're here and the transience of life, and you know, those kind of questions which also echoed to me. Then the Sufi poets, I remember Khalil Gibran and Rumi along the way. And then, of course, various poets that I liked, you know, as I continued to read and grow. There were women poets, um, Sharon Knowles, and from the UK, Sylvia Plath, of course. You know, she again, she's got a very, I think, prominent uh, sound working in her poems. Again, there's this almost like incantation. So I think I'm always drawn by the sound of poetry, you know, not just what it looks on the page, but uh, what what syllables are doing against each other and how they
Yeah,
strike the ear, you know.
there's a sort
So
of an internal logic to a line that it's not strictly rational. The way it moves you along, sometimes the rhymes and the sound patterns push you into a
yeah,
moment that you weren't anticipating. I think poetry does that in a
yeah,
way that other forms can't do.
yeah. The emotional cadence of the line or of the poem and how it works with sound. And I think that's really important.
So it sounds like you had this very particular, and it really resonates with my English degree as well, where it's, you know, it feels very canonical, and you're sort of in this kind of sacred space where you're kind of learning what amazing, you know, perfect writing is like, and then there's somebody who wants to write and you don't find yourself in that world, that you're kind of thinking, okay, well, what do I, as somebody who want to write, make of this, and how is it going to influence my own work? And I wonder, did were you still writing when you moved to the States, or did you start to write in a different way? I'm really curious about what happened in that transition from moving into the States, where perhaps you had been studying American poets, but actually maybe was that the point
Yeah.
at which you started to think about what you'd been learning, or?
Well, I think, you know, as long as I was in India and I was writing, I think I was writing really badly. I wasn't writing very great stuff, but I wrote and I wrote and wrote, you know, maniacally. Almost every day I was at it. I was writing, and then I did my master's there, and we talked about that a bit. And I was writing. I just didn't have any guidance. I was writing really badly, I think, and then I moved to the States. I had the first class, and so it was, you know, the jigsaw puzzles kind of pieces started coming together. Um, I wrote a poem called No, and I think it was a very, very seminal poem for me. It was an autobiographical poem, and that's a term I prefer. I never use the word confessional. I prefer the term autobiographical, because I think confession has all these, you know, it's a very loaded word with you know, with the background of Christianity and guilt and shame and all these things. And I don't think women should write poems and call them confessional. I mean, to whom are we confessing? Why do we have to confess? You know, so I did away with that term a long time ago, and I just call it autobiographical writing. So that was my first really autobiographical poem. It was me learning how to speak from an I that I could own as a woman. You know, it was my first direct poem saying, and the poem was about arranged marriages and patriarchy in India. So that was me taking ownership of my cultural background, my battles as a woman, learning to bring that I into my poem without any kind of apology, in the, you know, with the lyric spirit, saying this I has a right to speak. This I takes ownership of it, of her story. This I is not ashamed. This I does not have to confess. This I can speak, you know. So it was that kind of a poem. It was very, very important for me, because with that, I think I broke through understanding how to poise myself and how to poise my voice. And of course, I don't know, I'm not going to rate the poem, but it was an important poem because I learned how to find the I in the poem. You know, it became very important for that. And after that, it was a question of writing a number of poems over the years, you know, some good, some bad, playing around with that I, and so it went on the journey. But really, that was the seminal, you know, that threshold was really with that poem. And then it led to my first book in, I think, 98, I think was, I got my first book out with an Indian publisher at that time. And a lot of those poems were about my experiences in India, because when you come away, you have a bird's view. You're able to look at yourself in a different way, with a little bit of distance. It gives you some clarity, and I think also some courage to stand, you know, kind of put your feet on the ground and take a look at the past. And so that was how that first book came out. It was called Kali Dances, So Do I. And Kali is a Indian goddess, an Indian mythological figure. And it was a very deliberate choice because she's a very fierce goddess. And so that was my beginning of feminism too, in a way, as a feminist writer. And I've had a very strange journey. I mean, if I had to say, what were the pillars of my writing? So I had this feminist pillar, and then I had the Sufi writing, which is all very transcendental, spiritual poetry, with a sublimation and erasure of the self. And the feminist poetry is the ownership of the self. So on the surface, they seem contradictory, but I learned over time not to see it as contradictory too. These are aspects of myself. And I don't feel the need today to reconcile any of it. You know, you could be an absolute staunch women's writer, you know, fighting and And then you can have the most transcendental self-erasure moment and write of, your yearning or search for the transcendental, or for God, or whatever word we give. And all these can coexist within the same consciousness. It's very, very possible. And nothing is a betrayal of the other. I think it takes a great deal of spirituality to be a good feminist, and it takes a good deal of spunk, I think, feminist spunk, to be a true spiritual poet. So I don't see it as contradictory, but I remember in the beginning, I was confused myself. I mean, I can write these fiery social poems and then I don't want to have anything to do with any level. I want to just erase it all, so it was part of the journey, and I'm in a very comfortable space today, writing all kinds. So, yeah.
And I think poems are really interesting because you're able to kind of explore those different modes. I mean, I really love that use of the term autobiographical, because it already sort of sets up a suggestion that somehow there's a slight distancing of yourself from the work. You're saying, oh, it's an autobiographical work, but that in itself is a device, isn't it? And you're sort of saying, well, here, this might really be me, or this might be me presenting an autobiographical mode, but who knows? And this might be how I feel today, or it might be how a person in my situation might feel today, but it can shift. And I think that's liberating. And I think interesting poems can come from those powerful moments of conflict and being unsure about
everything.
Absolutely everything. So I was going to ask you about how, as a writer, you think about these. I mean, you've talked about it already, but thinking about the different modes and registers of experience. You've got your life in India that you're writing about, but also some of the poetry that I've seen that you've written seems very American. And how do you navigate, or has that shifted as you've lived in the States for longer, or do you feel like that the split between feminism and Sufism is reflected in maybe perhaps being drawn more towards thinking about your Indian childhood, and it sounds like there's a sort of a childhood in India and an adulthood in America, which are kind of jostling in your work a bit, or how do you think about that, and how do you process it when you're writing?
And a childhood in Australia.
Oh my goodness! Okay.
So no, I really don't see a breakage anymore. I think it's a continuum, because even if let's say I'm living in India, and I'd spent my childhood in one city and then my adulthood in another city and part of my, say, growing up in another city, you're not likely to quantify that with any kind of breakage, right? I mean, all it is a geographical distancing. I know we can't simplify it, because here there's an act of immigration that's happened, which in itself is a very, very, very complex thing. But there are phases to it, so the beginning phase is where you leave the homeland, and this is not to sound, ultra dramatic, but it really is a big step. You leave everything that is home, that's shaped you culturally, spiritually, emotionally, all of that. And you take that step of moving away. It's a big fracture. There's no doubt about it. And then you move to this foreign shore. And I think it's really ironical, because India spent a good many years trying to be free of the colonizer, and now we after that we followed the colonizer. We're either moving to the UK or we've moved to America. There's a very, very strange phenomena that happened once we got our freedom. We left the country. We started leaving the country. We're following that, the shackles that we wanted to get rid of. Now, it's a different current. We followed out in some sense, right? Whatever the reasons, whatever the justifications. So you come here, and now you're suddenly in this kind of dual sensibility. You have to, in some ways, adapt to make it, to be an American, to live in America or the UK, wherever. So you start to absorb very gradually. And in the beginning, it's almost humorous. It's little things like in India, we would say tomato and potato. And now and when I heard tomato or potato, I couldn't believe what I was hearing that first year. You're converting things in Indian rupees, for a 4 months. Like $1 is okay. That must be 17. Oh gosh, 17 rupees for half a pound of onions or whatever. Those are just little superficial things. And then of course you stop converting. You start saying tomato. You start saying potato. But meanwhile, you're absorbing quite a few things, and they're very unconscious as you begin to integrate. But you also find yourself in this fantastic space of freedom, because you now have this power of choice of what you want to take with you from the homeland, from the past, what you choose to keep with you. You get rid of cultural baggage. Immigration can be a very empowering stature too, because you can get rid of a lot of junk that you don't want to deal with or carry or live with. So you get rid of that, and because you find a certain kind of empowerment being in a new place. It's a kind of tourist mentality. When you're touring, you find yourself to be really free. If I go visit Macedonia or Slovakia for 5 days, there's just the kind of freedom that you feel, because you don't have all that baggage. But now this is no baggage for about 3 decades or whatever. So I think it's very empowering. I think at no point in history have we as human beings had the level of choice as we do now. I don't think at any period in history are we enjoying freedom. For a large extent. I mean, I know there's it's very restrictive still in some countries, but let's say in America, or just, I think globally, the level of freedom that we are experiencing as a human race, I can't think of another time in history where it's happened to this extent. The empowerment of women and rights and voting rights and what have you. I mean, all those steps have happened, right? So it's interesting. You as an immigrant, you keep what you want to, and you find a balance between East and West. I think this mourning for the homeland passes. And there's a kind of an integrative phase where, as cultural lifestyles are evened out, there's not too much of disparity then, going home. And then the things that bother you here, you go back to India and you find the same things bother you. People don't have time for you. There's traffic congestion. There's consumerism. They're all kind of parallel lifestyles that are going on now globally. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but we're kind of evening out a lifestyle, I think, globally. It seems to be for some sections of society. I know every statement I make has to be punctuated. They're always the less privileged, and I'm not oblivious to that. But I think overall there's a certain evening out, because there's a lot of westernization that's happened in India too. Kids, the way my daughter dresses, she's 18 years old, is how kids dress back in India now. I mean, it's just the same everywhere in some sense. So yeah, it's a complex question,
And in terms of, I'm really fascinated by that idea of kind of liberation of immigration, of what you can leave behind. Do you feel like you left some of those poets and writers from your degree behind, and you found new mentors and kind of people that would inspire you?
I know. I think I didn't really mean it in regards to literature. I was really meaning it in terms of, lifestyle and habits and customs and things like that. But in terms of, say, writers and their influence, and I'd gladly carry some things forward. You don't discard them. It's just that you evolve through it all. And yeah, I was referring to cultural choices more than literature. Yeah.
But you found new writers, or was it more that you found opportunities for you to begin your own writing journey at that point?
Yeah, so I think a really seminal part of it was in 2006. I was invited to read at Struga Poetry Evenings in Macedonia. It's a beautiful and fascinating poetry festival. It's the oldest poetry festival in the world. And the closing ceremony happens on a bridge. They build this beautiful bridge over the river Drim, and about 30, 35 poets around the world are seated on this dais on the bridge. And about 10,000 people come to listen to the poets on
All
the
on the
river
same bridge.
banks. Yeah,
It's
on
nice
the
and solid,
bridge.
is it?
Say that again?
It's a nice solid bridge, is it?
Yes, it is very solid. And it's been, holding those poets for a good about 40 years or 41 years. And the statistics are staggering. I was told about 6 to 10,000 people come there that evening to listen to the poets. It's one of the most, it's a moment I don't think I'd ever forget. You're on this bridge, 30 poets from around the world. There are people on the banks. There's the river flowing underneath you. And it was a beautiful festival. And I think that began in a formal way, began my exposure to world poetry. So I started reading Macedonian poetry, and then that led to invitations to other countries, and I ended up going to other festivals around the world. I started reading Mexican poets and Portuguese poets and what have you, and um, East European poets and so on. And that started on another journey. And I think I started enjoying the rhythms and the voices more, I think, from East European and South American countries. Uh, that resonated, I think, more deeply for me than contemporary American poetry. So it also gave me, I think, a tremendous amount of courage to say, like, I don't have to write like an American. I don't have to, there's no compulsion that I have to write like a 17th or 15th century UK poet. I'm not obliged anymore. I can learn from these voices, but I have to find a voice that's mine. I can't write even like Sylvia Plath. I shouldn't be writing like Sylvia Plath, and I'm not obliged to. So I think reading various international voices has helped me shape. Now, a good poet's a good poet, whether it's an American poet or a UK poet or a Portuguese poet, and bad poetry is bad poetry. So you always have something to learn. But when it comes to the question of, say, voice or poetics, it gave me the courage, to try and find my own way through all of this. And if I had to break it down, you'd probably find little segments from all the reading that I've done, where I've made my own way through it. I think the only challenge is to keep writing a good poem. That really is the only challenge.
It sounds really interesting. So I think what it sounds like you're describing is this kind of almost a state of poetics, an international state of poetics, where you find these places in these festivals. And I've had that experience too, where you go to a poetry festival and it's very international, and what everybody is intent on is hearing and making really good work, and learning from each other. And I think that can be really
Yeah,
empowering and inspiring. Um,
right.
I'm really fascinated that that's how your sense of yourself as a writer has developed. So you're not feeling like you've got to fit into the American system or the American poetic system, which is a very
Right.
dominant one. Globally, it's a very powerful kind of model.
Yeah, it
Um,
is. It is. And that I launched a festival called Matwaala, and that there I co-direct this festival with a poet called Pramila Venkateshwaran. And so we're always, talking about various issues, and one of the questions we talk about or we try to answer is, we have such firm models in place. There's a poetry industry everywhere now. You have MFA programs. Um, Poets are not just being taught how to write, they're being taught how to think, right? I mean, this is what happens through. How do you think like a poet? Which results in a certain poetics, which results in a certain voice. And then the next step is that leads to being published or not published, you know? So what happens if you don't write like that? What happens if you don't want to write like that? You don't want to sound like an MFA product. You have a completely set of different poetics, but you're not going to be published because you don't sound like a mainstream American poet today. These are very, very important questions I think we all have to answer. And our hope is that, Matwaala will turn into a publishing press soon. And, in our little mission statement for the press, we say, do you feel you're being pressured to write a certain way? And I think we all encounter this, because if you don't write a certain way, you're not going to get published. And I remember when I first wrote No, I was entering the Western model in some way. And I've grappled with it many times. And at some points, I just say, to hell with it. I'm going to write the poem I want to write. You either get it or you don't get it, as long as it's a good poem. But I cannot be forced to change my poetics just to be published. So then you have to find alternative publishing mechanisms. Either you start launching your own presses, or you say, they're just, this kind of hegemony, or this, it brings in so many questions. Poetry has ended up bringing up so many questions for me. So it's an important one. Who is being published? What kind of voices are being published? What does poetry ought to look and sound like? And those models are still Western, I think, to a very large extent. So I started finding a lot of hope, when I read, say, Octavio Paz, or I've been reading some other Mexican poets or some East European poets. Immediately, at least I know there are other models out there. There are other models out there. And I think part of the journey left for me is to go back to India, because we've had thousands of years of poetry in the regional languages in India, with fascinating poetic forms and modules, and the oral culture has been about 7,000 or 8,000 years old, of poetry being passed on generation to generation, not in the written form, but in the recital form. And so many different forms have kind of evolved out of that. And I know I still have that journey left to go and explore what some of those forms are, to see, can I bring those poetics into the English language, So that's something else I do want to do.
I was going to ask you about your relationship with Indian poetry and the Indian poetry scene, actually, because my understanding is that it's incredibly fragmented in India because there are so many different languages, and that it, to become kind of established in the Indian poetry world is very, very different from what would happen in the UK and the States, for example, which I know a lot better. And do you feel like you have a relationship with the Indian poetry scene in that way? Would you and how are you
how am I involved?
All that inspiration?
Yeah, it's we have a very strong Indian English canon too now. It started, of course, with the British. It began with kind of an imitative phase of, Victorian forms and poetry and so on. And then it went on, and then we went through the modernism, postmodern, we kind of went through all of that. So there's a very flourishing Indian English industry now. There are writing residencies and festivals and publishing houses and small presses. All of that is happening in India, very, very similar to the States or the UK. So for example, one or two things I've done, I can talk about. One of the magazines, online magazines, I was doing a diaspora issue for them for a few years. And so I kind of got the diaspora writing there, exposed that. I did that for some years. I'm in the middle of a really interesting project right now. I come from Hyderabad, and that was where I grew up till I was 27, and then I moved here. So we're doing a coffee book, what is it called? A coffee table book on the city of Hyderabad, with poetry and art by Hyderabad artists and poets. So I'm in the middle of editing that. And I have a creative partner there who runs a art organization, and she's looking into the art point of it, and she's engaging the artists, and I'm looking at the poets, and I've been deep. That was one of my COVID projects, which I've really enjoyed. I'm giving back to the city where I came from, and it's been really fascinating, and lots of young poets. There's a poem actually by Tagore, who went to India in 1936, I think it was, and he wrote a poem there. So we start with a Tagore poem actually, and then we come right up to the times now, where there's a rap scene, and it's just so dynamic right now. And we have lots of young poets contributing, and they're writing very skillfully and in various different stylistic monologues. It's really nice. So that's how I keep my links to India a bit in some way or the other. 2 years ago, I went back, I read in Delhi. The Sahitya Academy is like the Academy of American Poetry. We call it the Sahitya Academy. And I did a reading for them in Delhi 2 years ago. So the strings are there, it's not separate. And to the question of regional languages and poetry, it's very bustling. I think each of those languages in India have a lot going. They have their readings, their publishing houses. They're flourishing in their own domain. So, yeah.
So it sounds to me like you have this kind of pretty established profile in India. But you felt, I think you described it as trying to get into a gated community, but not having the code for the gate.
Oh, that's here. That's more in the West.
In the States. And I was really interested in the creation of this diaspora festival. And I'm really fascinated that you're setting up a publishing house, because it seems like the next obvious step that you would have a magazine or a series of publications to celebrate this really distinctive community that you, as if you've started to establish that. I mean, how established was it before in terms of kind of a poetry community, or is it something that you feel like you've managed to bring together?
I think I probably, well, let's say I haven't started the press yet. We put some outlines there, and I think most of my poetry activism is expressed through Matwaala. Because another thing I was questioning with the press, another thing that Pramila and I talk about, you write a book, you want to be published, a good publisher picks it up, and then you write a royalty and you give away 90% of it. I think it's obscenely unfair. And we wanted to set up a press where we're giving the poet at least 75%. The poet does a lot of the work. So we've been brainstorming on how to create a press that's not vanity, where the poet is not funding any of this, has a lot of say in the book cover, book design, and all of that, and will take the chunk, because as a poet, I know that thing, we're so torn. You would love to be published by Penguin or HarperCollins or whoever, Knopf or whatever, right? Or Faber. And then what do you get at the end of it? You're getting 10%. And poets don't talk enough about these things. It's completely unfair. You've probably taken you 10 years to write that book, or 5 years. And because you want that stamp of approval, or that stamp of that you've made it as a writer, so you go with these presses, and then you're completely robbed. That's the truth of it. It's the absolute truth of it. I mean, I think it would be fair even if a press said, we'll start giving you your 75% once we just make back our money for what we put in the book. Even that's fair enough, I think. But for the rest of your life to give you 10% for what you've written, it's a surprise to me that more poets aren't doing anything about this. So that's one of the things we say in the Mathwala Press. And I have to go in there and I think edit a bit. But I think we actually said we would give you back 90%, because that's your book. We probably need 10% for the little work that we're doing. We're trying to find a model on how do we raise money, because I have no seed money. See, I have no investors. There are no investors in Matwaala. We're not a non-profit. We don't want to go that way, because I don't want to be an art manager the rest of my life. I also want to be a poet. The minute you incorporate something, then that's a whole different deal. So, Pramila and I have been trying to do the best we can in a little way. So we do want to publish poetry books if we find a godfather of some kind who's willing to invest with us, and help us out a bit. But so we're trying to find that model. And I don't want to go into all the details of maybe the fundraising part we thought would help. We're trying to find the model where it's not vanity. The poet takes responsibility for the book a lot in terms of has a say in the blurbs, who does the introduction, how the book looks, and actually takes back at least 75% of those book sales with her or him. And I think that's how it should be. I think there's a lot of exploitation going on in the publishing world. It's sheer exploitation. So you you've produced the book and you should be, poets make so little, it's measly. I think we all know this. And then to give away 90% of is ridiculous. It doesn't even pay for your gas to get to that reading, So, so Matwaala is trying to do these things, and we're not trying to be parochial. I don't want to accentuate a South Asian voice as separate from the American voice. We are an Indo-American voice, as valid as another immigrant in this country, whether it be Dutch, American Dutch or the American French or the American English or whatever, there have been waves of immigration in this country, and we're as valid as them. So we want to be an Indo-American voice. And as Indo-American writers and poets today, I can't write like a pure Indian poet anymore. I'm Indo-American today. A lot of my experiences are from this soil. I'm coming to a point where I've spent more years here than in India now. So I don't want to reject the country I live in or what it's made of me or the way it shaped me. We have both countries that kind of shape us. So we're Indo-American poets. So all we're asking is, I think, to be asking for more visibility, asking for more representation. So to give you another example, recently I wrote to the Norton Anthology and I wrote to the Heath Anthology, saying we'd like to see more South Asian poets in your anthologies. We need to be more represented in the canon. And we got a reply right away from the Heath Anthology. John Lauter, I think his name is. I got a really warm mail from him right away saying, this is wonderful. Can you give us a list of names that we can look at? So we put together names and we sent it back. So that's how we're trying to change canon. And our readings happen in conjunction with universities and colleges, because that way the students and faculty can listen to South Asian poets if we're on campus, So it's very deliberate. We're not a stationary festival in the sense we have tie-ups. So last year we went to NYU, we went to Hunter College, and we went to Nassau Community College, and we did readings on their campuses. And we have a little session where we invite people to come and read the poems. We ask, youth to come and read South Asian poems. And then we try to maybe donate a few books to the library there. This year, Stony Brook University was going to, host us. But because of COVID, that kind of, that got canceled. But they're putting, I think, our readings, they video recorded the readings and they're going to put those on their website. So that was the alternative that they came up with. So that's the way we're designing Matwaala. It's an Indo-American voice. It's a valid voice. We just need to see more representation. How many South Asian poets are being published? If you go to the national conventions and residencies and readings and workshops, how many South Asian poets are teaching there? It's just not, it's not level yet. So that's all we're trying to do, is to increase the visibility. There are always a recycled 3 or 4 famous ones who are all the time recycled, but there are about 60 poets, maybe, writing, and they're good, wonderful writers. So sorry, I think that took too much of it.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I think the thing that I find really inspiring is that you would write to those kind of venerable kind of anthologies and say, where the hell are the Indo-American poets? I think that's really moving, actually, because I can't imagine doing that, where and it will make a difference. And you are making a huge difference. That I've got so many other things I want to ask you, but I think we're really running out of time. But the one, I suppose, that what I wanted to come back to is the fact that you chose, with all of this kind of international kind of scope and kind of influence, that you chose to do your MST in Cambridge. And I wondered, did that feel like a neutral space in some way for you to do your MST, or was it just because it was Cambridge and it was a really good course, or what drew you, and what how did it help to shape your voice, I suppose, is what I'm curious about.
It was a fantastic experience. I think overall it was really fabulous. And I think it was tailor-made at that point, because I think one of the weak links in my writing was my critical writing. And it was kind of nagging me over the years. I wasn't good enough at it. I wasn't happy with, if I had to write a review, or I just wasn't, I knew that I had to improve that area of it. And when I started looking out to write, to study, actually it was my husband who found, he said, Oxford and Cambridge have floated these part-time courses and you should look at it. And I kind of huffed and puffed in the beginning, because I said, who gets into universities like that? That's a reputation. It's just very grandiose and very reputed. And I kind of put it off. I said, I'm not applying. I mean, it's pointless. But then they nagged me, my husband and daughter nagged me to do it. And then I did. So I applied to Oxford the first year. I don't know why I didn't apply to Cambridge. My daughter thinks I said I didn't like the website, as something as silly as that. Some ridiculous reason. But I got waitlisted on Oxford the second year, I think. And then I applied to Cambridge. And when I read the course, I said, good God, this thing is tailor-made for what I want to do, because year one focuses on critical writing. And I said, oh, what an ass I've been. I should have done that last year. This is what I really want to do. I know it's going to be hard. I'll go kicking and crying, because it's never easy to learn something that you're not good at. But it was the course that I needed, because all the emphasis was on critical writing, right? The first year, you're not graded for the creative. You get I think a suggested grade or something, but you're graded only on your critical writing. So I said, here it is, it's going to be painful, but this is what I want. And I crossed my fingers, I applied, and I got in, and I loved it. I had to do the traveling, going to Medingley. Jem and Sarah Midge, they were really nurturing. I felt so privileged to learn from Jem the second year, because I did my poetry thesis with him, and it was wonderful. It was everything you hear about Cambridge, and there was a whole cultural part to it. I loved taking the coach. I mean, it became one of the most treasured chapters of my life. And I know there's always a question, what could have been better, which we ask of everything. And so I think the only suggestion that I'd have is, because it's so focused on kind of bringing a global studentship into, I think the course syllabus is a bit outdated. You need to include more contemporary writers. There are fabulous South Asian poets. There are fabulous Mexican poets. There are fabulous East European poets. And I thought the canon was a bit restrictive, that you're aiming to get students from all over. So it's good for those students to feel represented. I came out of 2 years, I hadn't read a single South Asian poet or fiction writer or playwright or anything, any of the genres. I didn't read a single South Asian. And it's not because they don't exist. So there's really no excuse that way anymore. With the whole Commonwealth, I think it can be a more representative course syllabus, which will probably be more welcoming and inviting also to students who are coming in, because you look for resonance and you say, oh God, there's Salman Rushdie there, or there's Vikram Seth, or there's, someone from India, there's, Keki Daruwala or someone. Then you just say, wow, this is an open program. It's cognizant of what's going on, So I think that would be my only suggestion.
I think that it's in continuous state of revision and development, and I imagine even since you did the course that it has been revised, but I am sure we have more work to do, and we will look forward to your letter with your suggestions of Indo-American poets to add to the syllabus. I just want to say, Usha, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. I've really, really enjoyed speaking to you. We hope you can, and we thank the listeners as well. We hope you can join us again for the next one. You will find more information about the projects and books that Usha has mentioned and the courses we run in the description box below. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks for the opportunity.